Hello, everyone. I am Kathy Wallerstein, Associate Director of the UC Davis Humanities Institute. Welcome to the third event in our fall conversation series, Democracy in Crisis, Democracy in Movements. This event is titled Democracy in Crisis ? You can find the first two events, Women Voting in US Empire and Social Movements in Times of Crisis, on our YouTube page by going onto our website at dhi.ucdavis.edu. And while you're there, please sign up for our newsletter so you can be informed of upcoming events. We're going to have to stop by 6:20 or so today, so I'm just going to dive right into introducing Wendy and James, and then they'll converse for about 40 minutes or so, and I might pop back onto the screen to ask a question, and then we will turn to the audience Q&A for another 20-25 minutes or so. So please post your questions in the Q&A and I will take them from there. Wendy Brown is class of 1936 first chair at the University of California, Berkeley, where she teaches political theory. Drawing from Nietzschean, Weberian, Marxist, Foucauldian, feminist, and post-colonial angles of vision, she writes about the subterranean powers and effects of contemporary Euro-Atlantic liberalism and capitalism, with particular attention to the subjectivities and social movements they spawn. The author and co-author of a dozen books in English, she is best known for her interrogation of identity politics and state power in States of Injury, Power and Freedom in Late Modernity from 1995, her critical analysis of tolerance in Regulating Aversion, Tolerance in the Age of Identity and Empire from 2006, her account of the interregnum between nation states and globalization in walled states, waning sovereignty from 2010, and her study of neoliberalism's assault on democratic principles, institutions and citizenship in Undoing the Demos, Neoliberalism's Stealth Revolution from 2015, and In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, The Rise of Anti-Democratic Politics in the West from 2019. She credits her thinking life to the excellent and accessible public universities of her youth and has worked in recent years to prevent their extinction. James Vernon is the Helen Fawcett Distinguished Professor of History at the University of California, Berkeley. He is a historian of Britain and its empire with broad comparative and theoretical interests in the relationships between the political and the social, as well as the nation and the world. His books include Politics and the People from 1993, Hunger, A Modern History from 2007, Distant Strangers, How Britain Became Modern from 2014, and the last volume of the Cambridge History of Britain, 1750 to the Present from 2017. His work has been supported by the British Academy, the ESRC, the ACLS, the NEH, and the Guggenheim Foundation. He is currently writing a book about the racialized and globalized formation of neoliberalism in Britain after empire, told through Heathrow Airport. Welcome, Wendy and James. And so I think you are each going to speak for a little stretch and then kind of pose each other questions, if I understand correctly. Okay, go for it.
I'm going to start off. And so thank you, Kathy, for that introduction, and for you all for being here and spending yet more, no doubt, unwanted time on Zoom. Since August, Wendy and I have had the privilege of working together with our colleague, Michael Watts, teaching a class on the crisis of democracy. Let's just drop the question mark, shall we? It was not just the hellscape of democracy in America or the rapid approach of next week's election that made the idea of teaching this class so compelling to us. All three of us, in different ways, had been preoccupied with thinking through two broad issues. Firstly, how has the corrosion of democracy in the United States that long preceded the Trump era nonetheless intensified during it, to the point where talking of a civil war doesn't seem far-fetched? And secondly, what was the relationship of the crisis of democracy in the US to its obvious fragility and failures elsewhere in the world, whether marked by the election of nativist authoritarian leaders in Brazil, India, Hungary, and Britain, the use of state violence to suppress democratic movements and protests for racial justice, as well as to stem the global migration crisis, or the widespread loss of faith that democracy can redeem our indebted and precarious lives, let alone transform capitalism or save the planet. Or the wholesale way in which a sense of the public interest has been restructured around market logics, leading our democracies and our educational systems to be subsumed by private interests from lobbyists, consultants, tech companies, and even manufacturers of voting machines. As our dean suggested we teach this class a few weeks before the semester began, we decided to approach it by interviewing scholars and activists who had informed our own thinking or had expertise where we didn't. We've talked with historians like Joan Scott, Robin Kelly, and Alejandro Velasco, political theorists like Karuna Mantena, Akin Vinayak, and Paula Biglieri, legal scholars like Tendai Achumi and Tim Kuna, geographers like Gillian Hart and Jeff Mann, scholars of public policy like Chris Bedo Milan and Robert Reich, and journalists and activists like Kate Aronoff. It's been a really fascinating series of conversations that has filled us, I think, with fear and hope in equal measure. Personally, it's just been a thrill and an honor to teach alongside two of the most distinguished, smartest, and most generous colleagues you could hope to have. So in the next 10 minutes, I want to briefly reprise what I've learned from these conversations so far this semester. Consider it, if you like, my midterm report on the crisis of democracy. Forgive me if you know all the stuff that I'm about to talk about, but I didn't, and I need to remind myself of what I've learned. I want to begin, as we have all of our interviews, by first outlining what I mean by democracy, how we might define it or imagine it as an ideal. I'll then do the historian thing and outline how we've grown accustomed to a more impoverished experience of the always compromised and limited forms of democracy that democracies have historically taken. In that sense, actually existing democracy has always been in crisis. And yet I'm going to conclude by suggesting what might be historically different about our current conjuncture. Wendy will then be able to provide you with a deeper excavation of the grisly politics of our neoliberal present and the immediate crisis of this election. So let me start with the question of definition. Everyone, even close to the left, would agree that democracy is not simply a set of political practices, principles, and institutions that enshrine sovereignty in we the people and culminates every few years in the election of governments. Instead, democracy is better conceived as both an imaginary space and a site of struggle. It's a promise that all of us, the demos in our infinite variety and multitude, can participate in creating a better world for ourselves. That means, I think, democracy must extend to all areas of our collective lives where we constitute ourselves as a public. It therefore must be enacted, performed, and practiced within and across multiple scales. Locally, in our homes, our streets, our workplaces, our hobbies. Nationally, in our public spaces, institutions, and cultures. And internationally, in the forums and infrastructures through which we try to think and act globally. So much for the ideal then. Actually existing democracies have always developed in begrudging and partial recognition of demos and its radical potentials. Indeed, arguably, in most parts of the world, most of the time, democratic processes have developed to constrain and limit the radical potential of governing by and for we the people. This has happened in three ways: by limiting who, what, and where democracies embrace. Let me spend a little bit of time on each. Firstly, the question of who gets to join a democracy. We all understand that class, gendered, and racial exclusions were the original sin of democracies in the ancient world, as well as the Euro-American model of democracy that emerged from the age of revolutions at the end of the 18th century. Moreover, as democracies have always been territorially bounded around and indeed inseparable from the formation of the nation state, they've also been articulated alongside immigration regimes designed to exclude migrants, invariably along racial lines, and to render those migrants invisible, whether through detention camps or the absence of official IDs and documentation. Secondly, what were the domains of collective life that could be rendered part of the public interest and subjected to democratic control? We most often think about this, I think, in Palanian terms, as the separation of the economy from the political, or of the supposed ring fencing of religion in the secular ideal of democracy. But we might also think here of how democracies often hardwired in the protection of certain corporate interests from the multitude, such as if the interests of the South with the Electoral College in the US, or those of the landed aristocracy in the UK with the House of Lords, or of particular castes with communal electorates in India. Thirdly, then, the question of where democracy was allowed is inseparable from its colonial history. Settler colonies, like the US, were precocious in extending the vote to white working men and women as a way of claiming sovereignty over territories stolen from indigenous peoples. Late colonial systems introduced partial representative mechanisms, often to defuse anti-colonial movements. And even international institutions like the League of Nations or the United Nations promised forms of democratic global governance, but did so under the sign of perpetuating the imperialism of the global north. These historical limitations of what I'm calling actually existing democracies means that perhaps we've never been democratic, or that democracy has always been in crisis. So what's new about the current conjunction? There seem to be two suggestions on offer. One says that history is just repeating itself, and we're living again through the 1920s and the 1930s, when a world depression nested new forms of fascism and authoritarian rule in fledgling democracies. The other sees the current crisis as a rupture from this history and rests on various versions, I think, of the same argument. Neoliberal, racialized forms of capitalism has simply now overcome democracy. Capital has not just freed itself from regulations by democratic states, it has bent those states to its will. Private interests have turned democratic governments into kleptocracies, so that our public institutions have become so degraded, they can't even effectively secure our public health in the age of COVID. Oligarchs get elected, speaking the language of the market, declaring science fake news, and promising white men that their authoritarian populism will defend them from migrants, women, people of color, and the woke generation. Meanwhile, the rest of us feel alienated and unconvinced that democracy can tackle the various crises we face, of escaping debt, surviving racial injustice, caring for our children and the elderly, and of course, saving the planet. This is the threshold I think we now face in the US. And even though it appears that unprecedented numbers will vote in this election, it's unclear that democracy, even as we know it, in this currently corroded zombie neoliberal form can survive? Assuming it does, where do we go? Can we make the system more representative to deliver majority rule by we the people rather than the minority rule for capital? How does the left try to reanimate the radical promise of democracy? Democracies have historically always been very hard to change. It's generally taken dramatic events like war or decolonization. So will COVID and the planetary crisis and the coming economic meltdown prove a sufficient catalyst? Those are the questions we can hopefully all return to later in discussion. But at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Wendy.
Thank you, James. It's going to take a minute for my voice to get loud enough through the technology for you to hear me. So I'm going to just start by saying a few things. One, what an enormous pleasure it has been to team teach while Zooming. And I commend it to all of you, but you have to find the right colleagues. You have to find people whose ideas you're interested in, who you know you're going to learn from, and who also do their share of the work. James and our other colleague, Michael Watts, not with us today on this particular scene, both of them have been all of these. So James very kindly left me the task of developing thesis 2 at the end of his presentation, namely the thesis that neoliberalism in particular and something about the effects that it's had on the globe, on the state, on the people, on institutions, on our ways of thought, on our orientation toward the public, have done tremendous damage to what was already only a promise, not a realization of democracy. So I want to begin by underscoring something James identified as a global crisis of democracy. And the reason I want to underscore it is that it's very easy right now, especially given the way we're all clutching our bellies about what is unfolding next week. It's very easy to just zero in on the train wreck that is our own democracy. And it's also easy to focus on some of the very concrete issues about which we're particularly frightened. The ease of disrupting elections with hacking, with trolling, the ease of warping elections with social media, and of course, dramatic misinformation, rumor, hyperbole, and worse. The ease of disrupting or mangling election outcomes with outsourced vote processing, or which we have a great deal of in this country, or distorting them with myriad voter suppression techniques. And all of these things matter, of course, but I want to suggest that we might survive and even secure against these were we not also facing the kind of crisis of democracy that James has already etched, that I now want to frame briefly as a decline of the social contract on which modern, liberal, democratic nation states were built. This decline is animated by several sources, including the global erosion of sovereignty and the transformation of citizens from rights-bearing members of polities into what we have come to call Homo economicus, little bits of human capital that may or may not be valuable enough for a state to decide to invest in. Partha Chatterjee has charted this erosion of sovereignty and detachment from the nation state by the people in a remarkable work called I Am the People, Reflections on Popular Sovereignty Today. I'm going to be citing some other works along the way because, as James said, we've learned enormous amount while teaching this course, and everybody I'm mentioning has not been part of the course, but has been part of my reading for the course. Michel Feher also treats this problem in a book called Rated Agency, Investee Politics in a Speculative Age, where he charts the movement of human beings from early days in neoliberalism as little bits of entrepreneurial human capital to what he calls financialized human capital, which also means state investments in that human capital or failure to invest in it are all that come to matter. But what do I mean exactly by an eroded social contract, especially given what James mentioned briefly, namely the raced genocides and dispossessions, the raced, gendered, and classed exclusions at the foundation and in the continuing history of almost every bourgeois or liberal or constitutional or representative democracy. I offer you all those possible names. In the past 4 decades, states around the world have been less and less oriented by and legitimated by social provisioning and social security for their populations, and increasingly oriented by and legitimated by capital and wealth accumulation. Trump's own open handedness about this, what matters, what indexes his success, is the wealth of the nation, the economic indicators of the nation, and above all, the stock market. His open handedness about this, I want to suggest, James and I would suggest, is but the culmination of this process, the process of a neoliberal repurposing of states as capital growth platforms. Yet at the same time, the global dimension of neoliberalism and its spawn, financialization, have also eroded the state's sovereign capacities to protect and to provide. It's not just that neoliberalism has stripped out social welfare programs, converted progressive to regressive taxation, privatized public goods, deregulated capital, defanged labor. All of those things, of course, are true. But what neoliberalism has also done is altered the very identity and power of states, and it has disintegrated and fractured the societies that they subtend and supposedly govern, let alone possibly represent. Now, as this process has voided states of any shred of democratic premise and promise, it has also generated the material for populist rebellion, rage against the system and the elites imagined to control it from left to right. In addition to this erosion of democracy through a repurposed state and disintegrated citizenry, there is, of course, neoliberalism's much more forthright, direct assault on democracy. Neoliberalism as a form of reason, as a form of governing, openly substitutes markets, but also traditional morality for democratic legislation. It treats democratic legislation as disrupting the spontaneous orders or even being a totalitarian substitute for individual freedom. More generally, neoliberalism discredits and aims to displace popular sovereignty. Why? What the classic neoliberals were explicit about is their distrust of popular sovereignty because the people, if they are universally enfranchised, will always want legislation that intervenes in and disrupts markets and even traditional morality. Thus, neoliberalism as a form of reason aims to reduce democracy to individual liberty, which of course we see everywhere today. Further, neoliberalism discredits the very project of social justice, whether that is the social justice of wealth redistribution or redressing subordination and exclusions at the site of race, of gender, and of sexuality. Again, the thinking here from the classic neoliberals through those currently in power is that markets and traditional morality ought to be left to do their own work, their own tried and true work in organizing society, including the hierarchical and even exclusionary dimensions of society. Now, this discrediting of popular sovereignty in general and social justice in particular also has the effect of legitimating a tacticalization of law and the courts on behalf of wealth and Christianity and anything else that can grab the levers of political power. This means that the obscenely gerrymandered districts and active voter suppression of the last several decades in the United States are understood not as anti-democratic or underhanded tactics, but rather the tactics for which law was designed. And of course, above all, what neoliberalism does is legitimate the assault on democratic norms, power sharing, compromise, negotiation, accession to loss, and of course, legislation for the common good. In short, the point, once markets and traditional morality are valorized, as they are by the neoliberal revolution, the revolution that in the North begins with Thatcher and Reagan. Once markets and traditional morality are valorized and the state is repurposed to support them, investment in democratic institutions or practices begins to go by the wayside. And this is not exclusive to right-wing parties, nor is it exclusive to the United States. That said, in the United States, the party of the right has tremendously intensified this process by its approach to the two huge challenges that it faced in the 80s. What were those challenges? One, building any capacity to win elections and pass legislation from what was a shrinking demographic base, the decline of white populations and especially propertied white populations relative to others in the United States. But the other challenge that the right faced was building support for plutocracy, something that had always been a part of its program, but now became explicit. Plutocracy, rule by the rich. And what it had to figure out how to do was build support for plutocracy from its base by keeping it angry, stupid, and resentful. In other words, these two projects on the right, that of building plutocracy and that of figuring out how to win with a shrinking base, one that increasingly basically guaranteed that the GOP would be a minority party, these two projects required dismantling democracy at every level, from pillaring education and disdaining intellectuals to jamming the judiciary with business-friendly judges weaned on the Chicago Law and Economics School and the Federalist Society. And this is, of course, exactly what the GOP has dedicated itself to. Again, through gerrymandering, through voter suppression, the kind of thing that historians like Nancy McLean have highlighted in her work, Democracy in Chains, or through blowing up democratic protocols and norms of compromise, negotiation, and bipartisanship, all the things we saw thrown overboard as our most recent Supreme Court justice was installed. This is the kind of thing that Levitsky and Ziblatt, in their important work, How Democracies Die, have charted at length. But also this sort of thing was achieved through deregulating campaign finance, lifting restrictions on corporate lobbying, lifting restrictions on how quickly and how easily ex-GOP legislators could become corporate lobbyists, essentially producing a revolving door between the legislature and lobbying. Licensing, in short, forms of corruption, the use of public office for private interests that James mentioned earlier. This is the kind of thing that Tim Cooner has documented at length in a work called Capitalism v. Democracy and a later work called The Tyranny of Greed. And then there's the kind of thing that Pearson and Hacker in Let Them Eat Tweets have recently brought fully before us, namely the project of normalizing plutocracy that the GOP has been engaged in, such that our current president could openly brag about the net worth of a cabinet. The net worth was over 3 billion, I think, of a cabinet he initially appointed to destroy the democratic purpose of every department that each of his appointees headed, from education to housing to labor to justice to the environment. Now, this plutocratic project, of course, is also evident in something like the CARES Act, the act that was supposedly a bailout for the little people that was unfolded in the early months of COVID. A close look at the CARES Act reveals it to be the single greatest upward redistribution of wealth in the history of capitalism. While the little people got their $1,200 checks in the mail or in their bank accounts, the CARES Act cut the tax liability of 50,000 Americans at the top end of the income spectrum by an average of $1.7 million apiece. In other words, while the little people got their $1,200 checks, 2/3 of the $2 trillion package that was the CARES Act was dedicated to massive tax breaks and cheap loans to businesses, mostly large corporations. So, surprise, in September, we got the following news. During the pandemic, 30 million Americans, starting in August, reported that they did not have enough to feed their families, while billionaires in August and September are reported over the past 6 months to have become 30% richer than they were at the beginning of the pandemic. The point, we need to stop carrying on about how Trump is all the terrible things that he is and recognize what brought him to power and what will outlast him. The GOP's brilliant long game of destroying democracy that was already so weakened by neoliberal reason and neoliberal practices. As its demographic started to shrink, and of course, that process was recognized as early as the Gingrich Revolution, but actually starting even further back with Reagan. While neoliberalism wrecked the American and working and middle classes, of all races, not just by outsourcing jobs, but by dismantling unions, suppressing minimum wages, imposing regressive taxation, stripping out public goods, especially the educational and welfare system. What did the GOP do? It beat the drum about free enterprise and demonized the social state. It dismantled democratic institutions and expectations. It jettisoned democratic practices and norms. It used neoliberal reason to treat law and its interpretation as pure partisanship. And it made voter suppression into patriotism. Above all, it fed the white working and middle classes racism and traditional values. It demonized immigrants, affirmative action, urbanites, environmentalists, feminists, global elites, and big government. And thus it was able to use that base to strengthen and enrich the plutocracy it was trying to build. Now, this has been put on steroids, as James said, during the Trump presidency, but not just by Trump, also by his enablers. And it is, as I suggested, really easy to get distracted by the revolting personality, the lies, the narcissism, the litigiousness, the bullying, the manipulation, the racism, the misogyny, all the strongman tactics. But I think what we're arguing is that the fate of democracy, the planet, and the most vulnerable on it are not on the line because of Trump. Rather, these things are on the line because of the shredding of democracy on every level that has been going on since the neoliberal revolution began and has been sped by the disintegration of the social contract that I spoke about at the beginning, that the Republicans were quite eager to see turned inside out. Perhaps even more important then the deleterious effects on institutions, norms, and the rest of it is the effect on the citizenry, which I would say is now a citizenry, in this country at least, dubious across the spectrum from left to right, that even the most basic element of democracy is intact, namely a universal franchise, one person, one vote, from which a majority will emerge to install a government that then is supposed to represent all. So let me stop there. And I think we are now ready either to take questions and conversation from, oh, no. Now James and I talk to one another. That's our next move. Sorry, I forgot our process.
I'm very happy, Kathy. If you want to come in here, but I just had one thing that I really wanted to push Wendy on a little bit. That was so fabulous and reminds me why teaching with you is such a thrill and an honor and a pleasure. But you have in a sense two stories going on there, and I want to just put a little bit of pressure how they come together. So on the one hand, I think that we're both completely accept that at some point new forms of neoliberalism take over the understanding of what politics is, full stop. And that degrades the social contract. It does all the things that you laid out so eloquently, but it's also structures the all sides of the political spectrum, I guess. So the other part of your story was how the GOP, faced with this bind between being the new minority party and having to try and figure out how to retain power for the plutocrats. My question, the thing I want to push you on, is what culpability do the Democrats have here? Because the Democrats are no less invested in the central tenets of sort of a neoliberal understanding of politics and what that political actually is. So how do we think about the relationship between those two parts, or does that not make sense to you?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, and I think it's actually a really important question. And I think right now, as we focus so much attention on all the really hardball tactics that the GOP is engaged in, it's also an important time to remember not only that the Democrats were full participants in neoliberal economics and public policy. It doesn't take much to remember that Bill Clinton is the one who proudly ended welfare as we know it, and that much about the Obama administration completely accepted a neoliberal framing of what were the proper metrics for public policy, including that all policies had to contribute to economic growth and the enhancement of human capital and so on and so forth. So it's not only the question, the case that they were all fully subscribing to neoliberalism as a mode of governing, as a form of de-democratization, I would say. But it's also the case, I think, that only in the last few years, and really just especially in the last year, have Democrats been as a party been in any way pushed, not just to give up neoliberalism, but to challenge it, to question it, by rethinking the prospects of a social state and forms of inequality that a so-called post-racial president was disavowing for at least the first half of his 8 years in office. But also, there's a way in which Democrats went along with so much of what we are describing, James, as the kind of, what shall we call them? The effects of neoliberalization, the tacticalization of law, the move from democracy to technocracy, the biopolitical governing, we could put it this way, of um, localities, groups, problems, ranging from crime to the question of gun control, let alone minimum wage. And so there's a complicity on the part of certainly the DNC with a great deal of neoliberal reason. That's not surprising. It's not something that one subscribes to or departs from if it's truly governing. But there's also, I think, a willingness to go along with a lot of its anti-democratic assaults on institutions and on practices until the crisis of democracy that is unfolding today, I think, really blew up in their faces. And even now, of course, we know exactly what the DNC did to kick Bernie and Elizabeth to the curb and get the classic old centrist and neoliberal reinstated at the heart of the Democratic Party. And one could say it was for strategic reasons, or one could say it's because there have not been many lessons learned about what brought us to this crisis. But the other thing I want to say, and then I'll stop and want to hear what you have to say about it, is I do think I had two stories here. And I do think they're not fully reconciled, but I think the reconciliation would rest in understanding the extent to which the GOP was rather brilliantly opportunistic about how to make neoliberalism's anti-democratic force work to save it when it was a sinking ship vis-a-vis its demographic. Tell me your thoughts.
Oh no, I think that's totally right, and I'm struck by the parallels of the reinvention of the GOP with the Conservative Party and the politics that we've seen in the UK around Brexit, where again it's the same question. It's how do you reinvent a party with a shrinking base to keep power for the plutocrats and to mobilize, a whole series of sort of nefarious cultural wars to try and keep the aging white disappearing base mobilized. So no, I'm very convinced by that reading of the GOP. I think what's really distinct about the US context, at least from a European perspective, is the way that the law has become such a central, the way in which the GOP has weaponized the legal process, and for me that's clearly one of the most damaging legacies of the Trump era, and that we're going to be living with for a while.
I think that's right, but I think that weaponization is also very long in developing. And I think this is where the Chicago Law and Economics School, which really did have a long game in populating the courts, not so much with right wingers, that's the Federalist Society, but the law and economics folks wanted to populate the courts with neoliberals who understood what law ought to be doing and ought not to be doing, which is it ought not to be involved in social justice, redistribution, legislating the public good, the common good. And what it ought to be doing is supporting capital and traditional morality. Now, the hard version, the hard right version of that comes out of the Federalist Society, and that's where everybody focuses. But I think this explicit understanding of what constitutional interpretation, what jurisprudence comes out of the Chicago School, Friedman's home, to transform what we understand social democracy to be, basically to demonize it, but also to make it essentially illegal, not just demonized. And that, again, I think, sure, Trump understood, put those justices on the court, get them all the way down from the Supreme Court all the way down, get them there and get them secured. But that's I think, a culmination of a long process. And I agree with you that I think if we think about crises of democracy in Latin America or in India or even in the EU, we're not going to see that particular set of moves.
I want to take this opportunity to remind people to post questions in the Q&A. There's a couple of very good questions already. And I guess I would love to just also ask you, both of you, what, I mean, thank you, first of all, for those, tremendous interventions. I didn't actually think it was possible to be more depressed about the state of things than I already was, but apparently it's quite possible. But I mean, I guess I want to ask what cause for hope there might be, in particular. I mean, you mentioned in the last few years, there was this sort of, the movement that gave rise to Bernie Sanders, that gave, rise to this kind of youth activism. There are examples and sorry, I'm trying to find the words. I guess, yeah, just what kind of a future what kind of a future can we look towards? With what tools do we have now? What is happening now that you can find any hope in? Either one of you.
I'll have a stab at this, Wendy, and while you summon your hope. I think we have to be hopeful. I think we have to be hopeful, and I think you're right to suggest that there have been some grounds for hope. And again, I think of this not just as in terms of the American context, but around the world. There have been sort of insurgent leftist movements that have mobilized very locally, and in some ways come close to capturing, and in some cases actually capturing the party structures. So those are signs of hope. Generationally, I think there's an important shift going on. I think that where I'm less hopeful, and maybe this is something that we can talk more about, is that the ways in which the sort of left are thinking at the moment about how to re-energize democratic politics, and that for me is a source of concern. I've just been reading this week Malm's latest pamphlet on the importance of eco-Leninism. So there's no question that just as the right have wanted to abandon democracy, so some sections of the left have think about that. And then we have alternatives, which can seem quite technocratic. Many of the people that we've been reading and talking to have been very excited about the Green New Deal, but also very wary and suspicious of the way in which it's a very technocratic vision of basically the state having to step in and save the planet, because we can't rely upon the popular mobilization to do so. So I think they're grounds of hope, and I think we've got a lot more work to do to think about, if democracy survives in the US over the next few months, how we can bring it back to life, and rescue it.
I would just add, I completely agree with James. I would just add that I think there are, lots of ways to think about hope, but the one that works for me is that you don't have hope, you make hope. And the people who have been making hope over the past decade in this world have been starting with Occupy and Extinction Rebellion and the Sunrise Movement. And then, of course, the most spectacular movement in the United States in the past 50 years, Black Lives. And what happened this summer, I think, gave a lot of us a tremendous amount of hope, because they were making hope, because so many of us were pulled into the streets by mostly young people who had never organized anything in their lives, but understood how to do it, how to learn about it on the spot and keep it going, and figure out how to make a combination of demands and solidarity and connection and insistence on demands that were beyond the possible and demands that are realizable. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of police units in this country and institutions are self-evaluating at this point about their complicity with white supremacy. That's not revolutionary, but that is a lot more than has happened with and in relationship to racism, institutional racism, in the past 50 years. It's done a lot more than all our equity and inclusion committees have done in the entirety of the institutional history that I've participated in universities. So I think these are the things that make hope, but they don't necessarily address all of these deep forces of corrosion and destruction of not just democratic institutions, but democratic imaginaries on the part of those who oppose these movements. The thing we have to remember, whether it comes to power or not, whether it's Modi's Hindu nationalists, or whether it's the neo-fascists in Latin America, or whether it's the 40% of voting Americans who still support this regime. And I want to suggest that the way to read this is not just that these are, yeah, they are last gasp white male supremacists, blah, 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 but they're also humans who are the effect of the destruction of a democratic imaginary that is inclusive, that is egalitarian, that is aspirational. And it's not that they're only that, but they are importantly also that. So lots of reasons to hope. I agree with James, but I think we have to be careful that we don't just go chasing hope to make ourselves feel more hopeful, but instead, as James said, start the hard work of figuring out what the left visions are for the 21st century. And those are complicated. They have to be global and local. They have to deal with the fact that finance is now the largest global force on the planet, combined with the Anthropocene, which is the other largest global force in, I meant to say global force in history, the other largest global, most powerful force in history. Those two things have to be addressed with whatever visions we have of democracy that are not about 19th or 20th century democracy, not just getting rid of the exclusions, the genocides, the dispossessions, the structural subordinations, but also they're not suited to this world, a world which is in transition, some kind of interregnum between nation states and whatever comes after. And at the same time, we know democracy doesn't work on a global scale. It has to be actually something that humans can know and relationship to the worlds they can touch, they can know, they can relate to. And so that's what we have to figure out economically, socially, culturally, politically.
Thank you for the excellent answers.
I saw that Brent had a question. Do you want to ask it, Brent?
I don't know how, Brent, can you, I see. So there's a chat question. Brent, can you put your question in the Q&A? There's a couple of questions in the Q&A that we should probably get to first. I'm not quite sure what to do about a raised hand, to tell you the truth. I assume Brent wants to speak. Brent, feel free to send me a chat if I see somebody else is raising their hand. Please post your questions in the Q&A, but if you, for some reason, really need to speak and that's why you're raising your hand, send me a chat message and we'll figure it out. I'm going to start with the first question from Matthew Stratton. Thank you. Professor Brown in particular emphasized how much of the anti-democratic atrocities of the past 3 years can be understood as corrosive undermining of the state, including its constituent institutions. Would both/either of you care to offer thoughts on how faith in the state, quote unquote, might be reinvigorated after many decades of what Foucault called anti-state phobia across a political spectrum, especially in academia, where the state is frequently shorthand for ineluctable hegemony, coercion, etc.?
Well, I'll just say this. I didn't mean to suggest that what we needed was to reinvigorate and reinvest in the state. What we need is for the state to reinvest in democracy and humanity and the planet. And what I was trying to suggest was that the state, it's loose language, but that the state has really, it's important to see how it's been hijacked, not just by rich people and corporations, that's true, but in particular by a form of governing reason in which the state is there to secure especially markets, but also I want to insist traditional morality. And you see that in Bolsonaro, you see it in Trump, you see it in Hungary, you see it in aspects of the UK too, I think. But I think we have to be careful here because democracy is never appropriately conflated with the state. Democracy is inherently anti-statist. The moment it invests its achievement in the state, it's removed from the people. So this is a long and complicated issue that we need a seminar or 6 to work out. But I guess I would want to say that on the one hand, it's important to recognize that populist movements, left and right, are deeply invested in the state. And one of the things we have to face up to about Bernie Sanders is that however much we supported the program, he was presenting a program which was not only one that would involve a significant state, but the continued health and growth of capitalism. That's how college, healthcare, housing, all the things that we consider basic rights were going to be funded. They were not going to be funded through a socialist revolution. Bernie is a populist to the extent that he also brings us into a dependency on a form of statism and a form of capitalism that depends on the continued growth of both. And that is not sustainable if we're also going to save the planet. So I think we have to face things like that. We have to face the deep contradiction in a left populism that has the state as the answer and capitalist continued growth as the resource. Modern monetary economics is not the magic that's going to get us out of that. James, I want to hear what you have to say.
No, I agree, and I think I can see there's another question which is in a sense pushing in the same direction. uh, about the state's association with surveillance and discipline, as well as welfare and securing a social contract or sort of common goods. We know that, again, I think of this both theoretically and historically. I think Foucault is here a great historian. He's totally right that the forms of biopower that came along with what we think of as the modern type of state intricately combined welfare and discipline at the same time. And it's one of the reasons why social democracy in its European incarnation lasted for such a brief time, because it was so tied up with the continuing forms of disciplining various subjects by gender and by race and by class, quite apart from its commitment to a growth economics that helped destroy the planet. So I'm totally with Wendy that my vision of a hopeful future is not a return to some type of technocratic, social democratic, state-driven process. We have to undo, if we follow Wendy's argument, we have to undo the very forms of reason through which the arts of government have been practiced over the last 40 years. And that's, that involves not thinking without the state as much as it does thinking how we have to rewire agencies of the state, if that makes any sense.
Thank you. I'm going to read a question from the chat from Robin Ballinger. Isn't there also a crisis occurring in the failure of the Democratic Party to signify an alternative? As you mentioned, both parties have furthered the concentration of wealth at the top, et cetera, but somehow the Democrats, through Obama, et cetera, were able to present themselves as an alternative for many years, but that image has mostly collapsed. Aren't we also witnessing neoliberalism as a class project that has little to do with Democrats and Republicans?
Sure, absolutely. And my only caveat is that I think that the Republicans have been more crafty and forward-looking, if you can say that about an apocalyptic vision, than the DNC. But of course, I mean, they've just been craftier in how to exploit the effects of neoliberal reason for their survival, and bolder. Some see this as their more Schmittian or Machiavellian power politics tendency, but I think that's a little crude. I don't think that quite captures it. So my answer to the questioner is, yeah, absolutely. The DNC is bankrupt. And, what we saw this year that was interesting was an attempt on the part of various pieces of the left to expose that bankruptcy and then to try to replace that bankruptcy with something that was viable and also would be attractive to millennials. And I think that effort we'll see it again, and it should happen again, because whatever answer we have in the long run to James's conundrum, how do we have a vision, a non-statist, non-technocratic, genuinely democratic, sustainable vision for living together on this planet? While we're doing that, at the same time, we need to prevent the extinction of the planet and the species and democracy that the GOP has put on steroids. And that means working inside as well as outside. And so I do think, another run at trying to push the Democratic Party hard to the left is the way to go. And I'm quite sure it will happen.
If I can just add to that, because I did want to ask you about the climate and the ecological crisis catastrophe underway. And I asked Michael Hart about this last week. I mean, and I agree with you about working inside and outside the system. We have to at this point. You know, we have for all sorts of reasons, but we also, you know, the world also can't wait for us to figure out how to do this right, how to sort of, you know, build a sustainable society, set of systems, set of structures. And I mean, it's just, you know, I continue to pose myself the question and to pose the question to others. You know, how can we act in the incredibly short period of time they say that we have to act in, with the resources we have, and with you know, I mean, with two hands tied behind our back, so to speak. You know, in Achille yesterday, in I think in response maybe to your question at the UCHRI Civil War event, said something about how instead of projecting the present into the future, you know, that the future, wait, how did he say it? I wrote it down. Basically, that instead of projecting the present into the future is kind of drawn, I forget his wording, but basically drawn back into the present, so that there essentially is no future. And I just wonder if you might comment a bit about that as well, and then maybe speak a bit more about the ecological crisis and how that relates to what options we have right now in terms of democracy, the project of democracy as you were speaking about it. Either one of you.
You know, I just say this, and then I really do want to hear what James says. I feel like on the climate crisis, when you have a crisis, you work on every front that seems like it might contribute to slowing or addressing the crisis. That means climate accords, that means transitioning everywhere we possibly can away from fossil fuels. That means education. That means waking people up to the implications of the climate crisis without paralyzing them in fear or fatalism. Um, that means all kinds of things, large and small. So I don't think it's a question of either or. We have no time to waste. We had no time to waste. We've wasted a lot of time. We must address it right now. I, for that reason, think that what's happening, what Extinction Rebellion is demanding, is absolutely right, but that's not a plan for solving the problem. They're pulling the emergency brake, and that's absolutely the right thing to do. And I'm glad that movement is doing it. It's helping, but at the same time, we need to figure out how to beef up the next round. You know, God willing, that we have somebody who will sign on to the next round of climate accords. James.
I don't have anything to add. I mean, I think, you know, we're living in an age of catastrophe where there's no room for ideological purity. It's all hands to the pump in any possible way. And I'm not really interested in getting into arguments about the correct political strategies of how to survive, how to save the planet, because I think everyone should do everything that they can, because we, as you say, we have no time to lose. I think that for me, thinking about the planet and democracy, the really interesting question is the one that Wendy's been talking about, which is we've always conceived of democracies as bounded by national territories. And the planet, I think, like the migration crisis, poses an absolutely fundamental challenge to the way we think of democratic politics. And thinking through those sets of questions, and to me, they're inseparable. The migration crisis and the planetary crisis are one, and they structure, you know, one of the reasons why we're living through a bankruptcy of democracy, or a crisis for democracy.
Thank you both. I want to check in with you at 6:20. Maybe we should close up. Okay. Thank you so much, Wendy Brown and James Vernon. This was tremendous. Really appreciate your sharing your thoughts and wisdom with us. Thank you, everybody, for attending. It continues to be strange not to see an audience, but I know you're out there. And for those of you who want to rewatch this or share it with friends who didn't get to see it, please visit our website. Boy, I just forgot it. dhi.ucdavis.edu, and our YouTube button is on there, and it'll be posted within a few days. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Kathy.
Stay
Thank
safe.
you very much. Stay safe, everyone.
Yeah. Bye-bye.